Welcome to the Inside Elections podcast, where we analyze elections in a nonpartisan, data-driven, and accessible way. In this episode, we'll talk about our latest House battleground poll in a rematch of one of 2022's closest races. We'll run through our recent House and Senate ratings changes, and we'll zoom in on one particularly competitive House race with Roll Call's Daniela Altimari. Buckle up. I'm Nathan Gonzales, editor and publisher of Inside Elections, the go-to place for nonpartisan election analysis for the last 40 years. And I'm headed to Arizona's 1st District to speak to a group at the end of this week. The district sits northeast of Phoenix. It's represented by Republican Dave Schweikert, and it's one of the most competitive districts in the country.
And I am Jacob Rubashkin, deputy editor of Inside Elections, and I am on my way. When you're listening to this, already probably on my way back from Charlotte, North Carolina, to give a talk to an industry group. And I will be at the lovely Omni Charlotte in North Carolina's 12th Congressional District, currently represented by Democrat Alma Adams.
Not as competitive as Arizona's 1st, but I'm sure you, what will we say, have a good time, or you had a good time? I guess.
I'm sure I will have had a good time. To all the listeners out there.
Well, this is a busy season for both of us, both trying to take input in terms of data and polling and on our reporting, but also output in doing webinars and speaking to groups. But this, if it wasn't busy right now, that would be a problem. So I'm grateful. We have a lot of things to cover, so let's jump in. Before we bring in Daniela, we are releasing our 4th House Battleground poll in partnership with Noble Predictive Insights. This time, it's Montana's 1st Congressional District, which was surprisingly close in 2022. Let's take a listen to a couple of ads from Republican Ryan Zinke and Democrat Monica Tranel.
Out-of-state corporations are buying up our neighborhoods and squeezing us out. And Ryan Zinke is helping them do it.
A real estate deal between Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke and Halliburton under formal investigation.
A commercial development that Zinke is poised to benefit from financially.
I've spent my career taking on powerful corporations to save Montanans money. In Congress, I'll hold those corporations and corrupt politicians accountable. I'm Monica Tranel. I approve this message.
After 23 years in the Navy SEALs, I've seen worldwide threats. But the liberal threats from D.C. are almost as bad. That's what I work against every day. Protecting our kids from the woke agenda. Protecting our paychecks from Biden's inflation, out-of-control housing costs, and higher taxes. My first year back in Congress, we got a lot done. But we're just getting started. I'm Ryan Zinke, and I approve this message.
Those are a couple of great ads. If you're listening, you might want to check out the YouTube version. Zinke, it's a very dramatic end and deep look into the camera at that ad. And also, you might also look up a different ad from Tranel, which is when they rented out one of Zinke's Airbnb and filmed her ad in the Airbnb. I think it's one of the most clever ads of the cycle. So you can check that one out as well. But the big news is our new poll. Jacob, what are the top lines?
Let's get right into it. This survey was in the field from September 11th to September 14th and includes responses from 432 likely general election voters. It tested that House race between Tranel and Zinke, which was a 2.5-point race in 2022. But it also tested voters' opinions on the massive Senate race going on statewide, as well as the gubernatorial race and the presidential race, the two other major statewide contests. In the House contest, Zinke led Tranel by 4 points, 47% to 43%. The Libertarian candidate, Dennis Hayes, received another 3%. In the presidential race, Trump led Harris by 6 points, 49-43%, with Libertarian Chase Oliver taking 2% and Green Party nominee Jill Stein capturing another 1%. And then in that Senate race, which may determine control of the entire Senate next year, Senator Jon Tester led his Republican opponent, Republican Tim Sheehy, by just 1 point, 45 to 44%. Libertarian Sid Daoud took 3%, and Green Party nominee Robert Barb, who we just got an update on his litigation, he is going to remain on the ballot, he takes 1%. And finally, in the gubernatorial race, Republican incumbent Greg Gianforte was the best performing Republican in the district. He led Democrat Ryan Bussey by 10 points, 47% to 37%.
Yeah, a lot of fascinating stuff in here. One of them, if we rewind to the Senate piece, because that is one rating change. We're going to talk about a bunch of House rating changes in a couple of minutes, but the big change we made in the Senate was the Montana Senate race, moving it from toss-up to tilting Republican in favor of Republican Tim Sheehy. And one of the reasons why is we had seen some previous data in this congressional district that showed that Tester was not getting what he needed in this district. And our survey confirmed it, because you might hear, oh, well, Tester was ahead of Sheehy in this, but winning by a point is not what he needs to do here, Jacob, right? What does he probably need to be at in order to win statewide?
Yeah, so this district is the more Democratic district of the two districts that make up Montana. And in 2018, which is when Tester last won re-election, he won re-election statewide by about 3 points. He won, or he would have won, because the district didn't exist back then, he would have won the first district by 10 points over Republican Matt Rosendale. So 7 points better than his statewide margin. So if you apply just a uniform shift, what we call a uniform shift to the poll results, a 1 point lead in the first district corresponds to about a 6 point deficit statewide. And if you look at the polling that we have of the statewide race, that is about by how much Tim Sheehy has led in some of the surveys we've seen coming out of Montana, mostly Republican-sponsored polls, but still the only public data that's out there. However, the thing that's even more worrisome perhaps for Tester is that the political dynamics of the state are such that he probably needs to do even better than he did in 2018 in this first district just to replicate his performance. Because while the state was once pretty evenly purple, the eastern part of the state is increasingly Republican. And so you need more and more votes from the western part of the state, where the first district is, to counterbalance that. So I went back and I crunched the numbers of Tester's three runs in the first and second congressional districts based on the current lines, but the election results in 06, 12, and 18. And I discovered that in 2006, Tester actually performed evenly in both congressional districts. He won the same number of votes in the first district and the second district. And that was enough for a 3 point win. And then in the 2012 race, he won about 8,000 more votes in the first district than the second district. And that was enough for a 3 point win, because he's won by 3 points every time, basically. In 2018, he won, I want to say, let me do my math correctly here, 30,000 more votes in the first district than in the second district. So in order to maintain that 3 point statewide victory, he's had to do better and better in the first district relative to the second district every cycle. And so not only is it a bad sign that he's underperforming his 2018 mark by 9 points, he probably needs to be overperforming his 2018 mark by at least a little bit in order to feel really comfortable statewide.
And he's not dramatically overperforming the other Democrats on the ticket, or at least the two big ones. I mean, Trinnell's at 43, Harris is at 43, and Tester's at 45, right? I mean, I think Democrats are banking on a huge overperformance from Tester because of his previous wins and his profile in the state. And it looks like Harris is doing slightly better than what Biden did in 2020. Harris, this survey has Harris down by 6. I believe Biden lost, or Trump won, by 8. And so Tester struggles to reach his marks can't just be pinned on Harris doing poorly in the district. It looks like she's at least close to Biden in 2020. So yeah, I mean that's I guess we took a little bit of a risk in that we changed our Senate rating before knowing the results of this poll. But this is just one more poll, but it adds to the previous data that we've seen that I think confirms that Tester can win, but he is running from behind and he has work to do over the next month and a half.
And just to be, I guess, a little more clear, because I was looking at a more complicated piece of data. In 2006, Tester won the first district by 5 points. In 2012, he won it by 7 points. In 2018, he won it by 10 points. If he's only winning it by 1 this time, it's not enough.
Yeah,
it's not enough for a statewide win.
That would have to be flipping the trend, completely. The state would have had to fundamentally shift its politics and geography. So we're going to have at least one more House battleground poll this cycle, maybe more. So stay tuned. Stay tuned for that. We'll talk about it on a future episode of this podcast.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say about the House race is that there are 2 things going on here. One is that Democrats are about to pour a ton of money into this district. House Majority PAC, the Democratic Super PAC, has about $4 million reserved in the Montana media markets that cover this seat. That's a lot more money than Republicans are signaling that they're going to spend. We'll see if the money actually gets spent. Those decisions can be changed up until the day the ads go up on the air. But clearly there are Democrats who believe that Trinnell is a winnable candidate. There are a lot of Democrats who really like her. The other point I'll make here is that Libertarian taking 3%. That is an important piece of the puzzle here. And it is something that Democrats have not so subtly picked up on. We actually took a look at some of the public Democratic, they're called red boxes, effectively, which is how Democrats and Republicans signal to outside groups what messages to use in campaigns, where to run ads, what to say in those ads. And when I was looking at the red box for this race that the Democrats have put out publicly, I found this passage, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I'm just going to read straight from the text because this is what's online. Voters who identify as Republican under the age of 60 and are open to persuasive information about the difference between Libertarian Dennis Hayes and Ryan Zinke should see ads narrowly targeted to them personally on streaming and digital platforms like Meta and programmatic CTV, and read in the Mail that Libertarian Dennis Hayes is a conservative outsider who is focused on draining the corrupt Washington swamp, building Trump's border wall, eliminating the government overreach of the Bureau of Land Management, and always standing up to the radical left. Whereas Ryan Zinke is just another Washington politician who resigned from Donald Trump's cabinet after facing 18 federal investigations, including allegations of corruption and abuse of taxpayer dollars. So Democrats very obviously signaling to their outside allies that they believe Dennis Hayes, the Libertarian, will siphon off votes from Zinke and help Trinnell win with less than 50% of the vote in this race.
Yep. And if someone wants to go down these rabbit holes in other districts, you can go to websites such as democratfacts.org or dccc.org/races. And those are the 2 places where the House strategists put their opposition research and put these messages out to outside groups. You might ask, why do they do that? It's because they cannot privately coordinate. So if they put them on the internet, even if it's in some nooks and crannies of the internet, then they're just communicating without illegally coordinating. So yeah, so stay tuned. Stay tuned for that. And we have that race. We still have Zinke rated with the advantage in the race, but it shows that it's close. And I think Republicans admit that there's work to be done, that this is not this race is not over, and they need to get Zinke into a stronger position or pull Trinnell down even further.
Yeah.
Before we get into our 2 big topics, we should talk about what happened on Sunday in Florida. Another assassination attempt against on former President Donald Trump. The trend seems to be, Jacob, when I'm not looking at my phone, that big news happens. This is what happened when Biden dropped out. It's what happened in the first assassination attempt. I was at two flag football games for my sons on Sunday before hearing about this news. I think what matters for us and for our listeners is this going to matter for the presidential race and down ballot races? My instinct is that pretty much nothing has mattered. I mean, if you look at the presidential race in general, besides the reset from Biden to Harris, it has been a very stable race. A first assassination attempt that was closer, I guess, or more serious, did not affect Trump's favorability rating significantly. So I'm skeptical that this will affect it significantly. But I don't know. Is there something else, Jacob, that I might be missing?
No, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head here. There have been two things that have changed the trajectory of this presidential election. One of them was the debate, where Donald Trump really pulled ahead after that first debate. And ultimately, that led to Biden dropping out and the switch to Harris and Democrats recapturing the lead nationally and in most of the swing states. And those are the only two things. I think the Butler assassination attempt was incredibly close, right? I mean, the bullet grazed Trump's ear. We're talking about a matter of millimeters. It was incredibly dramatic. The images from that day instantly became iconic and have since been adopted by Republicans as part of the central imagery of the Republican presidential effort, of Trump's effort. And maybe it helped him kind of push his lead against Biden. But remember, you were also dealing with the debate, and then you had the RNC, which could have, fostered a convention bump for the former president. So it's very difficult to kind of disaggregate whether the events of Butler actually did help Trump at all politically. I don't think that what we saw this past weekend at Florida was as dramatic or as close to tragedy. And so I think it's reasonable to say that it's just not going to have a lasting impact on the state of the race. I think the Republicans are astounded that people aren't really talking about what happened at Butler anymore. I think that it's a source of surprise and frustration, quite frankly, that they feel like the media has moved on, they feel like voters have moved on, and they can't understand why it's not a bigger deal that somebody came within an inch of killing the former president. And yet, if you look at the numbers, that's empirically the case.
And now, and there's some criticism that people have already moved on from this one, but in just watching CNN, as I've been on the road, CNN was what I gravitated toward. They were talking about this, all the most recent one, all the time, and had charts and maps and showing where the shooter was for how many. So I just think I also understand that frustration, but we're still in a news. Where breaking news, there's always going to be breaking news, and even if things are serious, that there's something that's going to take that place before too long. So
yeah, this election cycle has just been event after event that would be race defining in any other year, but are kind of a dime a dozen at this point in 2024, and we're still 54 days away from Election Day. Who knows what's going to happen next?
Yeah, well, hopefully we will not have another one of these close encounters or attempts, because it's not good.
It's bad news.
We should not be having to talk about this. In the latest edition of Inside Elections, we made more than a handful of rating changes. The biggest one might be the one we've already talked about, and that is in the Senate. We changed the Montana Senate race from toss-up to tilting Republican. That acknowledged that Democratic Senator John Tester is the underdog in the race. It also gives a clear and straightforward path to Republican control. and even a Republican majority in the Senate. So it doesn't matter who wins the White House, because West Virginia plus Montana would be +2, would get Republicans to 51 seats. But we also made another batch of House rating changes. And I'm gonna list these off, and then Jacob, I'm gonna ask you for the one that stuck out to you the most. In Alaska's at-large district, this is Democratic Congresswoman Mary Peltola. We moved that race from tilt Democratic to toss-up. Maine's 2nd district, which is Democrat Jared Golden, we moved it from lean Democratic to tilt Democratic. In Texas' 15th district, we moved from lean Republican to likely Republican. These are all shifts that would be in Republicans' favor. It doesn't mean that Republicans have the advantage, but in categories in Republicans' favor. Then we made a handful of shifts that would be toward Democrats. Arizona's 2nd district, from solid Republican, so off the map, this is Congressman Eli Crane, to likely Republican. Iowa's 1st district, from lean Republican to tilt Republican. New Hampshire's 1st district, lean Democratic to likely Democratic. New Hampshire's 2nd district, likely Democratic to solid Democratic. Those primaries just happened, so that was a factor in those races. Pennsylvania's 10th district, where Democrats are targeting significantly, from lean Republican to tilt Republican. And Wisconsin's 3rd, which is Republican Congressman Derek Van Orden, likely Republican to lean Republican. That's a lot, Jacob. And if you didn't get all those, subscribers got them last week. You can see those ratings online at InsideElections.com. But Jacob, maybe highlight at least one of those.
All of them are interesting. All of them are important. What stood out to me, I'll single out one here, and that's Iowa's 1st congressional district. This is the southeastern corner of the state. Iowa is divided into 4 districts. Basically, the state's a rectangle. You just bisect it in each direction, and that's how you get districts 1, 2, 3, and 4. They used to go in a very nice circle. They no longer do. But the first district, Quad Cities area, Congresswoman Marionette Miller Meeks, the Republican, of course, won the narrowest race of 2020, won by just 6 votes. And I think that this race is pretty emblematic, and the shift is pretty emblematic of the latest trend that we're seeing on the House battlefield. And that's for a number of reasons. It's a rematch, right? The matchup between Miller Meeks and Christina Bohannon, the former state representative who ran against her last cycle. This is one of a dozen or more highly competitive rematches. We talked about Trinell versus Zinke. There are rematches all across the country, coast to coast, that Democrats brought back some of their favorite challengers who are raising more money and running more professional campaigns this time around. It is a very evenly divided district. Trump won it by about 1 point in 2020. We expect that it'll vote similarly narrowly this time around. Iowa, of course, a Republican state now, but that Seltzer poll that we got a couple days ago from the Des Moines Register showing the former president with just a 4-point lead, I believe, pretty stunning. We'll see what her later polls say, but clearly an indication that Iowa hasn't gotten any better for Trump than in 2020. And then most interestingly to me, and perhaps a little bit more nuanced, it is not in New York or California. We have talked so much this cycle about how the path to the majority for Democrats runs squarely through California and New York, and the Biden district Republicans who flipped their seats in 2020 and 2022, and who are now the lowest hanging fruit for Democratic members, for the House Democrats to win back seats. And that all may be true, that the 5 seats in New York and the 5 seats in California are some of the best opportunities. But the reality is Democrats need multiple avenues back to the majority to feel comfortable. And some of Republicans' strongest incumbents are also in those states in California and New York that are top of mind for Democrats. And so it is absolutely good news for the Democratic Party that they have been able to expand the map outside of California and New York into some of these Midwestern states, heartland states, where they have real opportunities, and especially in districts that Trump carried, because this was something that was not even a question in 2022. There were one or two maybe districts that Trump carried in 2020 that were focuses in 2022, but by and large, Democrats were on defense in deeply Democratic territory. And so the fact that Democrats have been able to put a seat like this one squarely back on the map, expand their path to the majority beyond Long Island, the Hudson Valley, the Central Valley, and Southern California, is, I think, a very notable shift in the shape of the House battlefield.
Yeah. And this might unintentionally be a rematch episode. We talked about Montana. You brought up Iowa. In a second, we're going to talk about a rematch in Connecticut. So we've accidentally landed on the theme of this episode. I'll just highlight one before we bring in Daniela. I'll highlight one of those rating changes, and that is in Wisconsin's 3rd district, where Republican Derek Van Orden is running for re-election. And it's been stunning as we analyze the data that it is close up and down the ballot. It's close at the presidential level. It's close at the Senate race between Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin and Republican Eric Hovde, and it's close in the House race. And that's why we moved it from likely Republican to lean Republican. But that's also, I would say, generally good news for Democrats, because this is a Republican-leaning district under normal circumstances. So if Harris is keeping it close and Baldwin is not getting overwhelmed and the House race is close, then I think we can say that would be good news for Democrats statewide. This is not the type of district that Democrats need to win in order to get the House majority. But if they're challenging here and they're in the game, then they should be doing better in districts that are more competitive from a partisan perspective.
Yeah. And this district I always love because it's a great example of how quickly politics can shift. This district was drawn in 2012 as a Democratic vote sink. The Republican-controlled legislature in Wisconsin was trying to gerrymander the heck out of that state. And the way that they did it was they packed all the Democrats at that time into this Western Wisconsin district, then represented by Democrat Ron Kind. And in just a few short years, it went from being a Democratic vote sink to being a Trump district that ultimately elected a Republican, Derek Van Orden, when Ron Kind retired at the end of 2022. So it just goes to show that sometimes things can move pretty quickly if you're not, paying attention.
Exactly. Well, let's move on. And now I'd like to welcome our special guest, politics reporter Daniela Altimari. Daniela is part of the great CQ Roll Call politics team, also a veteran of the Hartford Current. Daniela, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Now, before we dive in, you have to tell us what congressional district you grew up in.
So I'm from Massachusetts originally. I grew up in Massachusetts 8, now represented by Stephen Lynch. I grew up in Weymouth, Mass, which is on the South Shore. The district is kind of weirdly shaped. It includes a little bit of Boston, a little bit of down the shoreline, down to Plymouth, and then some sort of inside towns. Weymouth is a direct suburb of Boston, about 15 minutes to the south. And it's a pretty large town. And that's where I grew up, and that was my district.
Now, I remember Stephen Lynch, I believe, was the first congressional candidate I ever interviewed more than 20 years ago. It was a special election. I believe Joe Moakley represented the district.
Yes.
And I, being a West Coast, Pacific Northwest kid where I don't believe we have accents, Stephen Lynch's accent as a Southie was startling. I was like, do we need it? I might need an interpreter for this, but I don't sense any accent from you, Daniela. What's the situation?
It's faded through the years. Sometimes when I'm up in Mass and I talk to my relatives, my brother-in-law, some of my other relatives, very, very heavy Mass accents. So my husband's from Rhode Island, which is a whole nother different accent. So it's probably just gotten watered down through the years.
And were you politically active, engaged, always interested in journalism? What was how did you grow up?
Yeah, so I grew up, I was always interested in journalism. And I think in 8th grade, we had to do like a research project on newspapers. So I did this big, long research project on the Boston Globe and visited the Globe. And that was really exciting for me as a kid. So yeah, I've sort of always gravitated to that. Originally, I was a Russian major at UMass, but that got way too hard. So I switched to journalism, which was definitely a better fit for me.
Wow. Russia. How long did you last in the Russian major?
I lasted about 2 years, and then we had to read like heavy duty Russian literature in the original. And I was like, I can't do this. I need like something much easier. So I switched. It was like a journalism concentration I think my actual degree is in English. And then I got a master's at Columbia in journalism. So it definitely was far less rigorous a path than Russian studies and Russian. That was, yeah.
Yeah, those books are hard enough in English. I can't even imagine.
You lasted 2 years. I don't think I would have lasted 2 hours.
Yeah.
In that major. Now you came to Roll Call previously at the Hartford Courant in covering the State House. I mean, your Twitter handle is even Capital Watch for those of you that want to follow Daniela on Twitter. How did that prepare you, if at all, for covering politics and elections on a national level with Roll Call?
So I started covering politics. I did local news at the Courant for many years, and then moved on to the statewide politics desk. And that was in 2010, right as things were really heating up. I mean, it's hard to imagine, some of these very competitive races in Connecticut in the mid 2010, 2012. We had 2 open Senate seats. There was a lot of change, a lot of turmoil. There was also a couple of really intense governor's races. So I came in with the new governor, covering the governor in the legislature at the Capitol in 2010, or I guess early 2011, with the inauguration of the new governor. And then, we had 2 bouts of Linda McMahon running, spending $50 million each time. So those were very fun and interesting races to cover. And, there was sort of a lot more turmoil and change in the state's politics. There were Republican members of Congress as recently as 2008 was the last one. That was Chris Shays, and he lost. But before then, it was a much more politically diverse district and state rather, and more competitive state. So it's kind of interesting to see how that shifted.
Well, speaking of Connecticut and competitive, that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on, is because one of the most competitive House races in the country is taking place in Connecticut, Connecticut's 5th district. This is where Democratic Congresswoman Jahana Hayes is, where she narrowly defeated Republican George Logan in 2022. They're facing each other again this fall. Let's listen to a couple of ads from each candidate.
I'm George Logan, and this is my mom.
Hola.
My parents came here from Guatemala and taught me how to work hard and stretch a dollar.
Rice and beans.
That's right, Mom. And these days, too many families struggle to put food on the table. I'm running for Congress to fight inflation. That's making everything more expensive. Rice, chicken, adobo.
Adobo, no.
Don't worry, Mom. Help is on the way.
Buen trabajo, George.
Soy George Logan y apruebo este mensaje.
In the Hayes House, we're committed to service. I'm proud to say I've served in law enforcement for over 27 years. Jahana's a teacher, National Teacher of the Year, in fact. She's taken that commitment to Congress, fighting to keep guns out of schools, safe drinking water for our kids, and making investments in our communities. We can relate. Our family has been through the same thing yours has. That's why we need Jahana Hayes' voice in Congress.
That is the reminder that it's not how you start, it's how you finish.
I'm Jahana Hayes, and I approve this message.
This race matters because Democrats need to re-elect all of their own members in order to have the best chance of gaining the 4 seats they need for a majority. But Hayes seems to be making this more difficult than it needs to be because of her lack of fundraising in large part. We have the race rated as lean Democratic. Daniela, what are the most important geographic areas of the 5th district as we take a look at this race?
Yeah, it's a really interesting district. We always call it kind of a claw-shaped district, or a lobster claw, because it includes a big chunk of the western half of the state, mostly not Fairfield County. I think there might be a tiny slice of Fairfield County in there. That's obviously the New York suburbs represented by Jim Himes. So it's a very wealthy part of Connecticut. The 5th district is much more mixed economically. It includes some sort of, in some ways, kind of these legacy cities, blue collar cities like Danbury and New Britain, where Danbury was the hat city, New Britain was the hardware city. Danbury is a very interesting and dynamic place, and also very fast growing, and is kind of emerging a little bit more as kind of a New York suburb. But it also includes vast swaths of rural Connecticut, Litchfield County, and less well-off pockets of rural Connecticut in the western part of the state. And then fairly recently, I think it was in 2000, the Farmington Valley was added to the 5th District. And that is a really interesting area because that is suburban Hartford. Some very, very wealthy towns, was always sort of bedrock Republican territory. These are, towns with lots of private schools and, prep schools and just, very sort of traditional Republican, New England Republican pockets. They've all pretty much shifted Democratic from, legislative seats, and even some of the local government is now held by Democrats, certainly for Congress. The shift there has really helped the Democrats, flip this district from the days of Nancy Johnson and then hold on to it since then.
Geography seems to be a through line in this race. How important are these geographic distinctions, even in such a small state? And does that help explain perhaps why Logan was unsuccessful in ousting Hayes last cycle?
Yeah, I think they do play a role. I mean, Connecticut is a weird place because it's 169 towns, and, Massachusetts is kind of the same way, many more towns, 300 and something. But, these New England states, they draw a lot of identity from their very local government. Local government controls a lot. Connecticut doesn't even have counties. They exist on the map, but there's no county government. The last vestige of counties was the sheriffs, and that's been sort of, that's disappeared. So it's kind of a weird place. You think of other places where county government is really key. That doesn't exist here. So everybody's identity is kind of tied to their town or their city. And so, yeah, I think it does play a role. I mean, whether it'll be enough to sort of make people skeptical of him, I don't know. But I think that connection does get fairly strong in a place like Connecticut.
And what do you think is the underlying cause for the distinction that we see in Connecticut between its behavior politically at the federal level, where it is consistently a Democratic state? It's voted for Democrats for president for quite some time now. You mentioned those two Linda McMahon races where she poured a lot of money into both of those contests, and I believe lost by the same amount both times. And yet at the state level, it's far more hospitable to Republicans still. The 2018 gubernatorial race was a nail-biter between Ned Lamont and Bob Stefanowski. This district was a nail-biter last time. Why is it that voters are willing to vote for Republicans down ballot when they've pretty clearly moved away from them at the top of the ticket?
Yeah, I think, again, that's something we see in other New England states as well. There's the popular Republican governor of Vermont, yet that is obviously, a fairly liberal state. I think the Democrats, I think, have very successfully in a lot of these places, certainly in Connecticut, have sort of the nationalization of politics has really played out in their favor. So you can say, well, I'll vote for my first selectman. They're Republican. I know them. Or I'll even vote for a mayor who's a Republican. Republicans hold quite a few local government seats in Connecticut as well. Governor, yeah, it could be competitive. The state did have Republican governors, Jody Rell, John Rowland. We don't like to talk about him, but there were quite a few. There's kind of a history of that. But on the federal level, it's just getting increasingly difficult, I think, no matter how much money you spend or no matter how good a candidate you are, to sort of overcome some of those things. I wrote a story a few months ago on the 5th District, spent some time with George Logan going around to supermarkets and diners and things like that. And I spoke as part of that story with Nancy Johnson, who, was the holder of that seat for many, many years, and very moderate Republican, supports abortion rights and all kinds of things that probably wouldn't be possible these days. And she said, even when she ran against Chris Murphy and lost, she said, they nationalized the race and that's what killed me. And so, you can say a vote for George Logan is going to be a vote for, the Republican House leadership or a vote for Donald Trump's agenda. And it's very hard, I think, to push for candidates to push back on that. I think that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, it's amazing. You mentioned, Nancy Johnson, and you previously mentioned Chris Shays. There was Congressman Rob Simmons. I mean, there were a lot of Republicans just in Connecticut, and now there are just a very few Republicans in the entire Northeast, in the Northeast corner of the country. On the 5th District, I got a little self-conscious yesterday. I was actually in Connecticut yesterday for an event, and Congresswoman Hayes was on my flight, and I got nervous because as we have written about this race, we have heard from sources that are concerned that her fundraising hasn't been as good as it should be for a top tier race, or that it's just the race, the campaign doesn't have the intensity that it should for her being in such a tight contest. So I was nervous that she was gonna come up and have some sharp words for me, and she couldn't hide because the gate agent screamed her name into the microphone and needed to talk to her at the desk. But anyway, Daniela, what is are we being too critical, I guess, of her campaign, or what is your assessment as you look at the individual candidates in this race?
Well, I think she does have that reputation of being thin-skinned and also not as perhaps aggressive, or she isn't open to a lot of interviews. I did sit down with her a few months back at a coffee shop in Farmington, and she, was fine. But I know other reporters have had a hard time sort of pinning her down, and that's almost been from the start. She doesn't come from politics. She was a teacher for many years. Her husband is a police officer. I think this whole world is, it's very new to her still. I mean, she was first elected in 2018, but it takes a while. She's not from the culture. She didn't come up through the legislature or through local government. This was her first race, running for Congress, and she won. So I think there's a little bit of uneasiness, stemming from that. She's a Black woman in a majority white district. So I think sometimes that can be a little bit of a struggle. George Logan is also, he's a Black man and Hispanic man. So, that's kind of an interesting dynamic. But I do think she does have a reputation as being a bit nervous with the press and with the sort of process of being a candidate and being out there.
Can you talk a little bit more about the role that race plays in this race? I think it's pretty notable. You've got two major party nominees who are both Black candidates in a district that is 65% white, not a significant Black population in the seat. And Hayes was, when she was first elected in 2018, right, she was one of several Democratic members of Congress who were Black candidates in majority white districts, which really was not something that we saw a lot of prior to that year. And then you had candidates like Jahana Hayes, like Lauren Underwood, who were able to win those seats. I'm curious what role, if at all, race plays in this contest, because I think I remember it kind of came up in some ugly ways last cycle when these two faced off.
Yeah, I remember in 2020, the COVID year, she was running against a guy who I think was a former law enforcement, maybe federal law enforcement. I forget his background, but it did come up in sort of very oblique ways in that race. That was her first reelection. That was a year when crime was, I guess crime is still a big issue, but crime and the perception of rising crime was really kind of on the forefront. That was the year, that was the first election cycle after George Floyd protests and things like that. So it was sort of hovering over that race. Now, I know from talking with Jahana Hayes, she has been lumped by her opponents, that guy she ran against in 2020 and subsequent opponents. And even now, some supporters of George Logan are saying this, that she's part of this ultra liberal squad, women of color who serve in Congress, AOC and folks like that. That is rooted in a magazine shoot that she did with Rolling Stone years ago, right when she was first elected, and it did feature AOC and Rashida Tlaib and some others, and also Nancy Pelosi, by the way. And she really, I think she resents that. I think she gets angry because she says, rightfully so, having examined this, her voting record is really no different than Joe Courtney, the representative, older white man and attorney from Eastern Connecticut, who represents a similarly sort of conservative leaning district, at least for Connecticut, conservative leaning. Nobody ever calls Joe Courtney a member of the squad. She's like, why are they calling me a member of the squad? Well, she did do that photo shoot, so that could be part of the reason why. But she does get tagged as being this ultra liberal, and I think if you look at her voting record, it's not that liberal. She broke with her party on a couple of votes. Most recently, the censure of Representative Bowman. She voted against that. She had her reasons for connected to something that happened locally. But I think she is suggesting that, because of her race and because of when she came in with this class of women of color, that she is sort of pegged with them. And I think she does resent that.
So if we fast forward to November 5th, election day, and as you watch this race, the returns come in, what area will you be most focused on to try to tell you who's going to end up winning this race?
Yeah, I think the Farmington Valley is going to be very significant. Again, if for some reason that starts trending towards Logan, even if he didn't win it, I think that would be very concerning for the Democrats. I think Danbury will be key because that's a big city. And there are a lot of votes there, and it's an interesting, diverse place. So those would be sort of the two places that I'd be looking at first. I know that the candidates are spending a lot of time and energy there. Then there's the small hill towns. Many of those are, it's sort of the Gilmore Girls territory of Litchfield County. Many sort of very liberal folks there, retirees who moved from New York, some of them. It's very wealthy. If Logan does better there than expected, I wouldn't imagine to him that he would win there. But if he does, that would also, I think, be another signal that things would be in trouble. And then, of course, how well Harris does, because I think that ultimately is going to just really shape this race. And when Biden was still in the race, I think Logan's chances looked a lot better than they do now with Harris at the top of the ticket, because she will win there.
I admit my Gilmore Girls knowledge is very limited. I don't know if they were, are they liberal? Were they? Are they? Are we supposed to talk about them in the past tense?
Well, I mean, it's more just that's like the vibe up there, the wool sweaters, the crunchy leaves, the whole, all the private schools and the beautiful, very manicured farms and things like that. That's Gilmore Girls territory, Litchfield County. That's where it ostensibly took place.
Yeah. And I think the top of the ticket dynamic is going to be so important here, like you said. And I know that one of the things we heard so much about from Republicans in 2022 was that they expected Bob Stefanowski, the gubernatorial candidate, to carry this district at the top of the ticket again, as he had in 2018. And that was crucial to Logan's path to victory, that at least one Republican would be winning at the top of the ticket. And in fact, what we saw was that even as every other statewide Democrat did worse in the 5th district between 2018 and 2022, Ned Lamont, the governor, actually did 10 points better. He went from losing the 5th district by 6 points in 2018 to winning it by 4 points in 2022. And that, in a race that was decided by 2,000 votes, I think that's pretty clearly a major factor. So if Harris can be an even greater, lift at the top of the ticket, seems like good news for Hayes.
Definitely. Yes. It's going to exert, I think, the biggest sway on this.
Well, Daniela, thank you for joining us, both for being a part of the great roll call team, but also bringing your Connecticut wisdom to us. But we also want you to hold on because you have to join us for our last segment. And now it's time for our Look What I Found segment, where we talk about anything new that we have found. It can be political. It's usually not. Jacob, what did you find?
So I found a Netflix show called Midnight Diner, which is a Japanese show about a small late night restaurant in Tokyo that is patronized by a pretty eclectic group of characters and is run by a quiet but wise chef whose whole thing is that he will make you whatever you want so long as you bring the ingredients yourself. It's delightful. It's quiet. It's not something that will get your heart rate up, but it's just a really fun, soothing show that there are 50 episodes of. So plenty to watch.
50.
Yeah, it ran for 5 seasons. And it's just like a balm. It's very nice.
Did anyone bring any rabbit yet that you?
I am sure that it's
ongoing joke, Daniela. Jacob had previously talked about his rabbit stews. No.
I'm sure that someone at some point brought a rabbit in, but not in one that I can remember.
Daniela, what did you find?
Well, mine is kind of lame because it's not obscure or like it's not a hidden gem. It's like a new show that's getting tons of buzz. So, but English Teacher, I think it's on Hulu or FX or one of those channels, or both of them, I guess. It's really good. It's really funny. It's really witty. It's a half-hour comedy about a English teacher in suburban Austin, Texas, and just sort of, it's kind of a workplace comedy. It's education. They talk about issues in education and students, and it's very funny, very different than Abbott Elementary, another school comedy, but just as funny and just as good. But again, not obscure in any way. It's like one of the top shows. There's only like 3 or 4 episodes out, but it's already getting a lot of buzz. So not really a hidden gem, but it is very good.
Well, wait for mine. Mine is not exactly a hidden gem because I found the Mohegan Sun, which is the casino in Connecticut that's been open since 1996. But I was just there. This week. Wonderful property. The architecture, like the inside with the waterfalls and everything. It was impressive. I was only there for a few waking hours, but I had a good time. So don't be alarmed that yours was not a hidden gem. Mine is very old. Did you spend any time at the casino, Danielle? You don't have to reveal all your dark secrets, but
I spent like several lost weekends at the casinos when I was covering state politics. The Republicans for many election cycles had their conventions there. So you'd go in like, Friday morning at like 7:30 and you wouldn't leave until Sunday night. And it was just nonstop, it was like,
that's a dangerous place to have a political convention.
Oh,
You're
man.
asking for trouble.
It was not great. And one of these, especially in 2018, it was a contested convention for governor. And it was late, it was smoky, it was exhausting. Every day was like 15,000 steps you were walking, you were eating, the food down in the food court. I mean, wasn't very pleasant.
Wow.
Was it in the arena that's off the basketball arena? I mean, to me, that was remarkable that the arena is just kind of steps, at least one entrance was just steps off of the casino floor.
Yeah, I know. Isn't it? It's pretty amazing.
Huh.
Yeah, quite a facility.
Well, thank you again for joining us, Daniela, and we look forward to covering these races with you as part of the roll call team and beyond.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have. We released the results of our latest Inside Elections House Battleground poll. We dissected the latest rating changes in the House and Senate, and we talked about Connecticut with Daniela Altimari of Roll Call. Thank you for joining us. At Inside Elections, we provide nonpartisan analysis of congressional, presidential, and gubernatorial races. With a combination of reporting and data, we break down the key races and bring valuable context to complex elections. Please go to InsideElections.com to subscribe to the bi-weekly newsletter. We've got individual subscriptions and group packages that are tailored for association and corporate PACs. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, rate us on your favorite platform, do everything on YouTube, click the thumbs up that you're supposed to do. We would appreciate it. If you didn't like today's episode, please email Chris Shays. We also want to thank our producers, Alan Tazinski and Melissa Lenner of Pretty Easy Podcasts, and our associate producer, Conrad Tolosa. Please come back and join us again next time.